Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I am Reverend Anna Bladel, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs also.
In this episode, we'll discuss the fourth Sunday of Easter, also known as Good Shepherd Sunday, which this year falls on April 30th. We have one content notification for this episode. We mention the KKK and talk about responding to transphobia and other violence in the deep dive.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So for this episode, we're super excited to have Reverend Anna Bladel, who is a writer, thinker, creator, and dreamer drawn to the theopoetic intersections of spiritual, academic, and activist engagement. They're the co-founder and co-director at Enfleshed, chaplain of students at the University of Iowa, and currently dissertating on theological and philosophical studies at Drew University's Graduate Division of Religion. They encounter the sacred most often and easily while communing with trees, cooking delicious food, sharing poetry, crafting with wood, and playing with their nibblings. Welcome, Anna. It is good to have you with us today.
We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here with y'all.
So, we are diving into ritual, which is a kind of fancy word. So I'm curious, what is ritual, right? Like, how do you define it or explain it for people?
Yeah, I love that. I think that I could probably come up with like a million different ways of thinking about and understanding ritual. But I think especially about ways of enacting or enfleshing or practicing, kind of putting into practice these ordinary encounters with the sacred or with sacredness. And so these practices that can support our surviving, our thriving, our grieving, our joying, right? Ways that we can bring and access and create meaning and beauty with intention and attention. And I think about doing the like nerdy deep dive, the way that liturgy is the work of the people, right? And so I think of rituals as the kind of the sacred labor of the people, the way that we encounter and make meaning and then share it with each other. And that part of enfleshing, it feels especially important. It's a practice. It's something that we are doing with our bodies and engaging through our bodies and the bodies around us.
I love that. Particularly like when you said the sacred labor of the people. And I frequently talk about liturgy as the work of the people.
Nice.
But like shifting the phrasing, just like I'm a 5, so I love the particularities of language. But like that's the sacred labor of the people is just like such a beautiful way to talk about it. Yep.
So, Anna, do you think that humans need rituals?
Gosh, I feel always hesitant to say what others need. And
That's
so
probably a good...
Right, it's like I'm inclined to say yes, but yeah, I know that I need them. And I do think that there's something, my hunch is that maybe all humans participate in rituals in some way, whether we frame it as such, understand it as such. And I do think that there is a like broad need, both acknowledged and maybe that we're not even aware of some of the rituals for our lives, particularly things that often, right, if we think about that like intersection of attention and intention, the things either that we're needing to draw attention toward or needing to cultivate a practice of intention towards. So I can't say a blanket yes, but I know that I need ritual, and I know that I hear and see a lot of people around me reflecting that need too.
Yeah. Well, and as you say that, and as you use the phrase drawing attention to things, I have ADHD, and I was trying to think about the different ways that we use rituals in our lives, and not all of them are religious, certainly. And so I was thinking about how I've had to create a little bit of a ritual around taking my pills in the morning in order to be able to remember later that I've taken them, which is always exciting. And I've also known some folks who have been diagnosed with OCD who essentially create rituals to deal with that. And so are these rituals different than religious rituals? Do they, what other helpful aspects of rituals do we find that people don't necessarily notice.
Yeah, I really love that. And coming with my own, like, no shortage of neurodivergence over here really resonate with,
Sure.
like, I have wondered a lot about that intersection with some of my own neurodivergence and ritual.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself both craving and needing some of that structure, some of that order, some of that like practice that draws my attention to something and enables me to kind of immerse myself in an experience and think about ritual a lot around that. And I know that I can get stuck then sometimes in the order or in the rigidity in a way that then keeps me from being really present and attentive. And so I don't know. I don't think that there's like any kind of inherent distinction there between like religious rituals and those daily rituals, partly because I don't think there's any inherent distinction between like religion and our ordinary lives. Like that's so much a part of, for me. I mean, that is where and how we access the sacred. But I really love like, right, it's whatever is helping us move through the day and move in our lives tending to what we need to tend to. And so whether that's taking our meds, whether that is like collective grieving, whether that is how to begin the and end the day in a kind of like prayerful attentiveness, all of that for me is part of ritual and like what gives it the good stuff, the good like richness and depth.
Yeah. That's beautiful. We were talking about ritual. I had not read Kay's question, and I was like thinking particularly about OCD and like the ways that that for me connects and the ways that that's like for a lot of people viewed negatively, right? Like the ritual, particularly for OCD, for folks with OCD, it's a coping mechanism for OCD, right? Like the relocking my car multiple times is a way that I make sure that my car is safe and locked, but also like it's an anxiety thing, and OCD is an anxiety disorder. And so like having that space to be like, what if it doesn't have a moral value? What if it is not inherently a negative thing, but it just is a thing?
Yeah.
And putting it, maybe not quite in the space of like lifting it up as a religion, like as I might for other rituals, but like at least like not pushing it down and not trying to like minimize or hide or get rid of it, but just say like, this is part of what I do. I lock my car multiple times to make sure that it is locked.
I really love that. And as you were talking about like coping mechanisms, that left me thinking about tools. And I've never thought about kind of ritual quite as a tool before, but like with any tool, like there's kind of a value neutral thing. Obviously, like terrible things are ritualized too. And I think about kind of ritualized violence and violence that becomes ritualized or normalized. And so thinking about what are we doing it like with and for, I really, thanks for that. That like sparked some really fun thinking. And I think about the ways like, so right now I'm drinking my tea out of a mug that my sister made for me and gave to me that has moved with me from place to place to place. And it's part of my daily ritual is then when I move from coffee to tea, I drink my tea out of this mug made and gifted for me by my sister. And I love that. And I can get into a place of like fearing that I'm going to break my mug. And then what am I going to do? And so remembering that like I'm ritualizing this way of bringing my sister and the love that I experience with my sibling into my day, and that like her felt presence and her love and her care in my life is not dependent upon my drinking my tea out of the mug, right?
Yeah. I frequently think about that with my uncle's a potter and was a potter and doesn't do it anymore because of arthritis and stuff. But I think about that with the bowls that he has made me. And every time I like get to think of him, but also every time I'm like, there's a chip in this one, there's a crack, like,
You're talking to someone who literally had like a drawer full of broken things for a while, the things that I've broken that are like either too beautiful, too meaningful to just put in the trash, that I've like needed to find some way to ritualize in order to release and let go of. So I feel you.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that space of like bringing what is frequently held as ordinary into the sacred place, right? And it's super queer, right?
Yeah.
Like the queering of sacred, profane, of holy and not holy, and being like, no, it all fits within it.
Most binaries, that binary does not work. Like,
right. False binary, as we say on the podcast.
That's right.
But then I think there's also this space that I'm curious about, because I think there's a conversation that happens around like quote unquote traditional worship, where a worship with like a written liturgy is talked about, depending on who you are, as either definitely more holy or as like boring or less spirit filled. Yeah. And I'm curious like how you navigate those sorts of conversations as like a person who believes deeply in ritual and the ways that like we as humans enflesh ritual and enflesh the sacred.
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, there are so many parts of me that are really drawn to traditional worship, whether it's sometimes like high liturgical settings, like that way of, again, passing on and experiencing like the most beautiful depths of tradition. There's something that's really beautiful to me about immersing in that sort of lineage, that sort of like being with and becoming with folks who both precede us and then those who will come after us. And so I have like no sense that tradition or traditional worship is inherently boring. I just think often it's not done very well. There's a quote I was trying to get before this about like the same tired words. I'll try to track down the who said it. And there's just, I think maybe it was Naira Wahid, but it was definitely a poet. But the ways that like whenever we're relying on the same tired words or the same tired actions, that's I think where it becomes boring, where it becomes stale. And anything that is like kind of rote tradition can do that. And so a huge part of why I sought ordination through the denomination that had been my home tradition was my call to the sacraments, to the rituals of communion and baptism. And I have seen communion and baptism both done terribly, either just because it's so boring that the beautiful sacred meaning is like leached out of it, or done in ways that are violent and abusive and oppressive and diminish the sacredness within us and around us. And both of those continue to just like the reinterpreting of what that means, what it can mean, the ways that if we're talking about the water of life, we better be talking about like water as life and indigenous land restoration and water protection, and the ways that talking about the water of the womb, the water of the sacred, like that being part of our DNA and being remembered and welcomed back into over and over and over that sacred water, that both has this like just gorgeous meaning and needs to propel us out into the world to protect the water that is life. So I went on a whole little like, I don't know, water river there. But
it was flowing. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. And so for me, there isn't anything about it either being like traditional worship being more or less sacred, but like, is it done with creativity and with felt depth and with that sense of connection to the sacred? And you were naming, Emily, the like words and as a 5 and like finding and crafting language that compels us and that opens us is part of what I love about the language then of ritual, and I think is like worship done well.
Yeah. And I think there's also, so my grandmother was Catholic. And so when I grew up as a Lutheran who frequented a Catholic church in the month of August every year in Connecticut, right? Like, and there is something about the ways that the words that we say in worship that trace frequently back to scripture are the same for Catholics, the same for Lutherans, and like we do it differently. And definitely I had opinions about which was more boring and which was less boring, which was done with like an emotion and a feeling of connection and power and meaning, and which was like more the tired words.
Yeah.
But there's also something that is so beautiful in being able to go somewhere else and not be totally lost in the ritual.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's like, as someone who has lived in other countries where other languages are spoken, to know, even though I don't know what language we're speaking, I know the words that you are saying as you preside over communion. I know the words that all of a sudden everybody is saying together because I heard the word for father at the beginning.
Yep.
And I think that particular connection is something that is amazing and a gift. And also, right? It's always the and also that, like, I'm watching my way through Greenleaf on Netflix right now. And spoilers for those of you that have not gotten to season 4, the Hope and Harmony, like, mega church denomination or whatever has taken over.
Oh, dear.
And they require the same song be sung at every Hope and Harmony church every Sunday.
Yeah.
Just as one of their songs. But it is a white song.
Yeah.
And to sing it in a black church,
Oof.
like, there is more than one episode where they talk about it. And so there's like a delicate dance, right? Like, it's not that I need everything to be exactly the same when I go to the other place. It's the places of connection where there is something where I'm like, oh yes, I know this piece.
Yeah.
Oh, right. This is.
Yeah. Isn't that so often the case with like the familiar and the unfamiliar with like belonging? How do we know that we belong in a space? Often there's something of familiarity or a kind of like collective, something that is shared collectively. And that also usually, maybe always, I don't know, means that there is some kind of line being drawn of who doesn't then belong. And I think about that with liturgy a lot. And I love ways to then bring folks in. Like, that feels like then the creative work of it, and those ways of bringing a whole lot of different like difference and variety itself into a ritual, because they're alive. Like, they take on the meanings. Like, I think of every time we then enflesh a ritual, we're part of like both claiming but also changing what it can be. I love the queer possibilities of that too, thinking about kind of what we queer and what we claim and what we reclaim, as well as what we may resist and say a like hard no to.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really resonate with that rhythm. I think about often when I hold up like a loaf of bread or something. I don't need to be in the context of worship or of communion, but I think of breaking it. I find myself wanting to like lift it up and honor this sacred nourishment that is being shared, and to think about our bodies in need, our bodies like beautiful and broken within the world, and the ways that we need nourishment for our bodies and nourishment for the journey together. And whether that's with bread and wine, or whether that's with, pizza and beer, or often with my students, it's dark chocolate we pass around a bar. And then it matters that it's like fair trade dark chocolate, right? Like not wanting to participate in the breaking of bodies around the world by eating, I was going to say particular corporations, but the chocolate through.
I mean, we could eat their corporations. It's eating the rich.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. I did Young Adults in Global Mission, which is a program in my denomination for young adults. And one of my friends who was in it was in Argentina, which I had done a study abroad in. And when we came back, we were talking about different things. And she talked about mate, which is a tea that a lot of people are like somewhat familiar with, but have no clue the like how it is in South America in particular, and the different ways that it is ritual. And she talked about passing mate around and talked about it as communion, in that group that she was in, and that has stuck with me. I did that before seminary, and so that has stuck with me as part of how I understand, and like one of the lenses through which I thought for seminary, of like, how are we looking at what communion actually is, and the more expansive understanding of it versus restricting it to, it is only when these words are said in this precise order.
Yeah. I love that.
So one of the things that I love about Enfleshed, your like brainchild, is the ways that Enfleshed has created liturgies and rituals around some of the more common things of life. And I've found myself like going to the Enfleshed website to be like, I need something that I'm not going to get anywhere else, particularly when it's like has to do with queer people, right? That's like one of the go-tos is like, okay, I know that Enfleshed is more likely to have this resource, or to have a resource around grief that is queer informed and trauma informed. And I'm curious if that was part of the original hope for Enfleshed, because I like my first memories of Enfleshed are like preaching resources.
Yeah.
And so this is related, but was that part of the like original hope for it, or?
Yeah, I love that question, and it warms my heart to know that you have gone there like with that sense of seeking and need, and then found something there. That definitely has been part of our own longing from which Enfleshed emerged. And I think it absolutely was the impetus for Enfleshed. Really, it kind of started over a delicious, thinking about communion, a delicious meal at a wonderful local Indian restaurant, Masala, between Em and myself. And we were talking and connecting over this shared longing and the excitement of offering with and for our people what we were collectively longing for and finding unmet in the religious communities and even spiritual communities that we were immersed. And so thinking about what would we do and what could we do if we were unconstrained by all of the like limitations of either tradition or denomination, or kind of expectation that we not be too radical, or that language not deviate too far from this tradition, or that, right, like, but really to feel that imaginative freedom of how to be with each other in our longings, in our needs, in our griefs, in our joys. And so, yes, the common stuff of life, particularly for those of us who know too well how our common lives can be erased, ignored, denigrated, demeaned by the church, by the world. And so putting language to those moments in life that may be small with outsized meaning, or that might be huge moments that go ignored by kind of dominant structures, that felt really, really beautiful, and like the work that we were wanting to do. And I think what has changed about that is our particular context.
And so for those who don't know, M. Jade Kaiser is the co-founder and co-director of Enfleshed, for some context.
Yes, thank you. And we love collaborating together and creating together. And over the last year, we brought in a third co-director, Robert Monson, who is just a delight to work with. So we're now this like holier heretical trinity of folks working with a wonderful team of writers who write the liturgy and Liturgy That Matters, the sermon preaching, worship, liturgical resource. So we have the writers for Liturgy That Matters, and now another writer who creates kind of the prayers and poems that are part of then worship materials. And we also have a liturgy library, and that's where kind of our collection, we've started adding kind of the poems and spells and things that people might not think of as liturgy, or who are coming from spiritual background or context where church might not be part of it, but are still seeking those like words for what matters, and words that acknowledge kind of what matters in our midst.
Yeah. So speaking of that, one of the exciting things coming up for Infleshed is this new resource of creative rituals. And could you tell us about this resource that's coming up?
Oh, I would love to. I would love to. I am so excited about it. It is called Sacred Incantations, Rituals of Trans Wisdom for Every Season. And it should be out, we are hoping, and available to folks in June. And it's a repository of trans wisdom, these incantations that like cast spells for our blooming, that refrains that can root us in our aspirations for collective life, the affirmations that accompany us and become these portals of possibility. And we have more than 70 trans, two-spirit, gender nonconforming people from a wide variety of contexts who have participated in creating this resource. And there are 76 incantations, and most of them are paired with a ritual written around the incantation, and then each one will be on a card that has original art on it also. And so there's this like nourishing beauty visually as well as verbally, as well as then in fleshing it. And we are so excited about this for a number of reasons, in part just trans folk are scattered. We are scattered, and we are experiencing both a new and not new tsunami of legislative violence, of physical violence, of spiritual violence. And having this resource that roots us and grounds us in our collective wisdom has just been really beautiful to work on, particularly in this context. And I'm in a state that has been just like every day there is a new horrible bill that has passed, that our horrible governor has signed into law. And so having this thing that roots us and grounds us in our sacred wisdom has just felt very enlivening, sacred, and connective to be in that collectively. So I'm really excited to like have it in my hands and hold it after so many months of working with ritual writers and starting to see the art come in. And I'm really excited to have it available for others. I'm planning on using it both in terms of fleshing the rituals with my students, and then also wanting to find a way to collect folks digitally and virtually so that we can participate in those rituals together too.
Yeah. And a friend of the podcast, River Needham, is one of the contributors. And so I don't know what the ritual is, but she did share what the prompt for it was. Yeah. And I am so excited about it. It also reminds me of the Trans Halacha project that our Easter Vigil guest, Rabbi Becky Silverstein, talked about when he was with us, of like creating new prayers and new halacha for new experiences and new realities. And so we'll link to that too, but I'm excited for when this comes out and we can share with our listeners about it. Is there like a pre-order space, or is it just like wait till it comes out?
There is not a pre-order space quite yet, but forthcoming soon. So keep your eye on all things Infleshed for that.
Yeah, and we'll share with folks, at least on social media, if not on the podcast, depending on timing too.
Wonderful. Folks. We loved a part of the vision for this project was bringing together kind of the wisdom that is shared collectively, almost like as close to kind of universal trans wisdom as is possible in the incantations. And then really inviting folks to think about their own particular context in terms of creating the ritual, knowing that like the way we ritualize our lives depends on what our lives are like in all of their particularity. And so really seeing those come together, has been just really beautiful.
Yeah.
Great. So do you have a favorite ritual from this upcoming resource that you'd like to tell us a little bit about?
Oh, I can't.
Or maybe just one that jumps out at you.
I can't.
I know. Favorite is a hard word.
But I'm loving like seeing people get creative. And so bringing in pleasure, bringing in sometimes erotic pleasure as well as like physical pleasures, bringing in the earth, bringing in whether it's rollerblading or right, like we have a lot. It's fun to see some of the themes that tend to be points of connection across contexts and across different ways that people are understanding ritual. And then to see, so things like breath, feet or hands on the earth, that kind of grounding, lighting candles or incense, engaging the senses. And then the things that I never would even think about for a ritual that people bring in. So yeah. Can't pick one, but love them all. And I'm really excited. Some of them I have been like done myself as I'm working with the ritual and working with editing the ritual. And that has been its own pleasure, particularly getting to inflesh the rituals from folks who I've never met in person and only interacted with by email, or something too very, very intimate about that kind of sacred connection that I love.
Yeah. So this question is a similar question, but kind of thinking maybe more broadly through your life. I'm curious if there's a ritual or a couple rituals that, as you look on your whole life, that are like particular favorites, or maybe surprisingly favorite or surprisingly meaningful, or that sort of a thing. Recognizing that there is no way to pick just one, but maybe the ones that bubble to the surface.
Oh, I love that. Partly because we were talking about communion, when I think about what I have grown up knowing as sacred ritual, communion is probably it. I love grain from the field, fruit from the vine, like the elementalness of that and the sharing of it, the intimacy. Serving communion has been one of the like greatest privileges and joys. I particularly love serving communion to kids and like, come up and giving them like a particularly giant chunk of bread and seeing like grin come and then coming back. There's so much that I am drawn toward nourishment, toward food. And so communion like is it. And gosh, I think about maybe absolutely connected to communion, brunch with one of my very favorite people world. We went to seminary together. She is the best bruncher I know. And we have shared brunch in so many different places throughout so many different years. And every single one of them is sacred. And there is something about, we have rhythms and routines in it. And being at the brunch table, wherever that table is, with Sonia is one of my favorite rituals. A ritual that is kind of a favorite in my own spiritual life right now, that's part of my daily ritual practice, is starting the morning, lighting a candle, lighting incense, and spending some time with my tarot decks. And I have a particular kind of regular ritual of what I pull with what decks, and I use that as part of grounding in my own daily life, in addition to then using that in a lot of other ways. But that kind of daily morning ritual, making coffee. I like have to have my coffee first thing in the morning. I don't want to talk or interact or do anything until I've had coffee. And used to grind my own beans every morning as an earlier riser. I now, for the sake of not being the only one in the household, I the coffee more often ground now. But I do like pour over, and did that before I knew the word pour over. But there's something about process of making it that has a ritual element for me.
Lutherans have a joke that coffee is the third sacrament.
Oh, absolutely 100%. By that, yes. I like travel with coffee, not so much because I have to have like fancy coffee or anything like that, but I need to know that I'm going to get to have good coffee. And when you have your own coffee with you and your own filter, like all you need is hot water, and you can have amazing cup of coffee.
Yep.
And I think, I don't know, thinking about those, I was getting excited about returning to this season. So my mornings over the winter in Iowa start in darkness, in cold, and I like have that. I light a candle. I wrap myself in a quilt that was made by Frances Morse, a woman in the first congregation I served. She gifted it to me when I left. And so I, that like kind of coziness. And now I'm starting to get the garden ready for planting and remembering in my body the ritual that I will start practicing soon of first thing in the morning, making my coffee and going outside with my coffee barefoot and seeing what is emerging, seeing what's blooming, and then eventually like picking the tomatoes for breakfast. And I think about one of my nieces would go out and greet the garden every morning. So now I hear her like precious voice in my head saying, "Good morning, baby kale. Good morning." And there's something
I love that.
greeting the aliveness in the world and then being greeted in our own aliveness that I love. So I could keep going with ritual.
Those are beautiful. I love those. Yeah.
Well, and keeping in mind that not everything always works out the way we planned, and also remembering that in seminary we were taught to call certain things a good learning experience. Do you have a least favorite or maybe a just especially terrible experience with ritual of, well, that was not the way I thought that was going to go?
Oof. Goodness. Yeah, probably more than I want to count. Both in terms of my own, I think my most like cringeworthy, particularly if I'm leading a ritual, is maybe if I get too lost in like trying to either get it right or make it perfect or, and kind of lose in that the capacity to really be present to it. And then anytime a ritual is rigid or is forced or is coercive, that's even worse than when it's boring or flat.
Yeah.
But like anything that moves through the motions of something that has such potential to be rich and nourishing and instead just, I guess, doesn't go deep but stays at the surface, then it falls flat. And I think about how often rituals are used. I mean, you were talking about how they can be points of belonging, and that means they can also be points of alienation. And yeah, so, if it's communion and done either just as this like thing that now is what we're doing in worship, but doesn't have any kind of like depth connection, and then far worse if it's promoting a theology of sin and salvation that is deadly, like, no thanks.
Yeah. I think about the documentaries and movies that I've seen, particularly about the Ku Klux Klan, and the ways that they have taken the ritual of baptism, which is this expansive belonging and love of God for everyone and all of creation, and made it into a weapon.
That's right.
To join in this group of hatred, of dismissal and fear and violence. And like,
whenever you're playing with power, right? Like sacred power and oppressive power. Back to the tool. What are you doing with it? Are you using it for destruction and devastation and death, or are you using it for connection and enlivening and flourishing and freedom? White supremacy manages to get into a whole lot of rituals and then is ritualized in a whole lot of ways that need a whole lot of disruption.
We're doing Thanksgiving for baptism right now at the congregation, at one of the congregations I serve, because it's the Easter season. And so that's what we're doing. And the Lutheran Church comes out with like suggested liturgies for seasonal liturgies. And for the most part, they're like pretty good. They're not nearly like as provocative or uninhibited as like enfleshed liturgies, but also they have not figured out like they have not really grasped fully the impact of the language of the liturgies and how they perpetuate particularly ableism and racism and white supremacy.
Yeah.
And so like there was one thing where I like changed it from like as bright as day or whatever to like
White
the bright right to the like brightness of the rainbow, or like that God shines like a rainbow, or right. And so like those particular things where I'm like, I am not surprised that the whitest denomination in this country is doing this. And also, let me just fix that for us.
Yes. I think that's like one of the ways that I got into ritual and liturgy and started writing my own liturgy was both my love for language and for playing with words and poetry, and really taking seriously the ways that like I cannot, particularly in a worship context, but like I am unwilling to say in liturgy something that I either don't believe or something that does violence. Like I won't do it. I can't do it. And so then that means we have to rewrite a whole lot of the liturgies that have been handed down. And particularly if we're working with whatever like denominational book of worship, some of them are getting better, but a whole lot of them, whether it's language as like simple as language for God and pronouns for God, pronouns for each other, or those like insidious ways that light supremacy masquerades as white supremacy, and that like horribly toxic violent masculinities are imposed upon the divine, right? Like all of that stuff. We have a lot of rewriting to do.
Yeah.
Reimagining.
Speaking of rewriting and reimagining, are there rituals that you wish existed but you haven't encountered, or something for which you wish there were a ritual? I guess would be another way.
Oh, I love that. I imagine that like anything that I could imagine, probably someone has created a beautiful ritual around, and I just like don't know it.
So maybe one that you haven't encountered.
Yeah, I would love. So thinking right now around, again, this tsunami of like anti-trans violence that both is and is not in any way new, and the solidarities that are called forth through that. I love imagining like what would a ritual of disrupting anti-trans violence be, whether it's like a ritual that young people could learn in youth group for if one of their classmates walks into the bathroom and starts being harassed in the bathroom. What would liturgical disruption there look like? And how could that be part of what is learned in youth group? I think about collective, those moments when we collect ourselves, whether it is around a mass shooting. How do we ritualize moments of police violence, of violence that is anti-Black, of gun violence, so that we don't become numb to it? How do we mark these moments of whether kind of ineffable joy or ineffable grief, the moments that kind of tear at us, that break us open? What are ways to mark those moments that do some semblance of justice for what we are experiencing, and then enable that to like move us more toward a collective that is tender and caring, where life is allowed to flourish, where Black life can flourish, where trans life can flourish, where CRIP and disabled life can flourish. I think there's a lot there that is our collective sacred labor of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just preached yesterday on the struggle with like there are so many shootings these days that it is hard to feel connected to any of them. And
Yeah.
like there's a theological and a like faith and spiritual response of like, that is not okay to not feel
Yes.
when people are shot.
Yeah.
And when people are killed.
Yes.
And like, what even do we do when those happen more than once a day?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it leaves me thinking there's like part of what ritual can do is hold a container for something, like create a container to hold what we can't hold otherwise, what is either so enormous that we need some kind of structure in order to hold it, to be present to it. Yeah. Got me thinking and longing for those rituals, and more so for the world that we could like enflesh into existence through them.
Yeah.
That we are enfleshing into existence through our insistence and our resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no good transition for this. I'm wearing my 2NB to transition shirt just for this.
Oh, I love it.
But, and now for our most ritualized segment.
And it really is.
It is our most ritualized segment. Let's make a Muppets musical.
Yay!
So this is the place where we cast Muppets for one of the readings or for a Bible story, or as Kay suggested before we started recording, perhaps the Muppet that we most want to do a ritual with.
Yes.
So Anna, do you have thoughts on
I
on
love
the
these
Muppet?
questions. Yeah, on the Muppet.
Or Sesame Street, all the things.
Yeah. So I feel like anything where like Cookie Monster could meet Bert and Ernie, like I just want to see what that looks like. And maybe I'm just drawn to that. Like I want cookies in my mouth, and I like want to. So I want some
I'm on board.
ritual there. I also, when I was thinking about the Muppets for this and like feeling the need to go into a little bit of the like nerdy research of the Muppets, I learned that there was a Muppet character called Ronald Grump in the late 80s who tried to con Oscar the Grouch out of his trash can.
Well, that did not work.
Oh my goodness.
And so I was thinking about like the thieves and the bandits coming up in I think it's in John.
The gospel, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
And how like, I don't know, Ronald Grump and all of the capitalist cronies who try to take everything good away. But maybe the ritual, like I want to do a ritual with Oscar the Grouch. I just feel like that kind of energy brought into rituals is a little bit about like what cuts through some of the maybe surface saccharine stuff and gets us to what could Oscar the Grouch get behind in all of his wonderful grouchiness that actually would be meaningful? Like I think that would be really fun.
Yeah. I love the idea of doing a ritual with Oscar the Grouch. And I think there's a way that like one of the spaces that I think is lacking in ritual is grumpy rituals.
Yeah.
Like, so often we are doing rituals in response to things, right? Like even thinking about in response to violence. And we deserve to be grumpy about that.
That's right.
Like,
yeah.
I mean, grumpiness is not the only thing I feel about violence.
Right.
But there is this like grumpiness with elected representatives who continue to not do anything to stop the violence, with communities that are stuck or paralyzed, with myself when I'm stuck or frozen, when communities are stuck or frozen. Like, yeah, let's be grumpy.
Yeah.
Let's like dig into that grumpiness. Yeah.
Absolutely.
When I was thinking about John, though, I was thinking about the part where it talks about the shepherd's voice. And I was like, oh, this is an easy cast for me. You just put the, like Electric Mayhem, Dr. Teeth and Electric Mayhem, and you, like, they're each a different corner, and the sheep go to the voice that they know.
I love it.
That's a solid choice.
Yes.
And when it comes to grumpy or grouchy rituals, I think not only Oscar the Grouch, but also Eeyore.
Yeah.
From Winnie the Pooh would have to be there. Because
Yes.
there's different kinds of grumpiness. Sometimes it's more an angry grumpiness like Oscar the Grouch,
Yeah,
and sometimes it's more sad like Eeyore.
that's right. Oh, I'm just having such a wonderful image of like Eeyore and Oscar meeting and figuring out how, like, what kind of ritual they need. Yeah.
That
And
would
they
be
would
like
love,
the most adorable.
yeah, neither of them would demand the other one had to talk to them.
That's
It would
right.
just be, quiet
Yeah.
companionship. Yeah.
And they wouldn't try to like coerce the ritual into a like tidy joy or, to end on a positive note, but to really, really be honest about the whether angry grouchiness or the despair.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
Okay, did you have you were going to cast somebody else, I think.
Oh, yes. I was looking at the gospel reading and I was thinking about the sheep in the sheep gate. And I think that Sean the sheep from Wallace and Gromit and all of his many, 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 many friends who show up in, I believe it's the Wallace and Gromit episode, A Close Shave, when they are dealing with the knit-o-matic machine and all the exciting things that happen. Sometimes you are excited to let the sheep in through the gate, and sometimes you need to close the gate and just have fewer sheep for a little while, and that's okay.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
And definitely makes me think of the Sleep Number bed commercials.
Oh, yes.
And the sheep from the Sleep Number bed commercials.
Reasonable numbers of sheep.
Y'all are amazing. I feel like I want either a like gospel according to the Muppets to come from y'all or like the full on liturgical year based on the Muppets. There's like something.
We have been we have been talking about going back through our episodes and writing down all of our castings and having the full list of the Muppet Bible musical ready to go at some point, but it would take a while.
Please like that musical too.
Right. Well, so this whole thing came from a Twitter conversation between Kay and Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, who like were talking about like a Muppets biblical musical epic thing.
Yeah, I think Rabbi Rutenberg brought up Muppets and it just kind of grew from there, but
that's awesome.
Great. So it would be fun. I was looking at past episodes to link to for one of our other episodes, and I discovered that both Easter to this year and last year, which was our first Easter season with Let's Make a Muppets musical, I cast Elmo as Thomas. And I was like, points really for consistency. Like, yeah.
I'm like envisioning where Miss Piggy fits into like
so many places,
right?
All of them.
All of them. That's right.
She got double cast on Easter. Like,
yeah,
makes sense. Yeah,
she's a diva. She can play all the parts.
Yep,
absolutely.
I do like that together. We all cast like the same passage. We all cast the gospel, but none of us like cast the same part. Like we have the thieves and Ronald Grump, and we have the shepherds and Electric Mayhem, and we have the sheep and Wallace and Grump, Sean the sheep and friends. And I think I would throw in, I think it's Lammikin.
Oh,
Is that the like Muppet?
I can
Not
see
the Muppet, the puppet.
Sherry, what's her name? Something.
My sibling had a Lammikin growing up, so I might be confusing the name of the lamb. Chop.
Lamb chop.
There we go. So I'll throw lamb chop in there too.
Yeah.
But I love now I'm gonna have to. I have time between now and Friday. Maybe I might. Usually I just find pictures of all of them for our Friday post about Let's Make a Muppets musical. But I might actually try to make an image for this whole thing.
Amazing. I am going to look for that.
Sure.
So
Anna, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
So many, especially now. I want to make sure to draw people's attention toward the new Enfleshed podcast. We have our first inaugural episode just out, and a conversation between three co-directors, myself, and Robert. We're really looking forward to doing some of those deep dives into the sacred wisdoms that are nourishing our collective lives and our collective liberation and flourishing. So in podcast solidarity, I want to draw folks' attention to that.
Yes, and we will link to that in our episode description for folks.
Fantastic. So and also just really, I don't know, encouraging all of us to get invested and deepen our investment in our collective survival and our collective flourishing. So the survival and flourishing, again, of trans folk, of Black folk, of poor folk, queer folk, of brown folk, young and femme and disabled and sick and old folk. And those coalitions are going to be how we're going to get free, and how we carry each other, and how we care for and are cared for by each other. And while that puts us in contact with a whole lot of the pain and the violence wreaked by oppressive and dominant systems, it also puts us in contact with so much joy and beauty and enlivening forces. And so that ongoing invitation, and then maybe, like, I don't know, slowing down and putting our hands in the dirt, finding ways to engage kind of the emergence and the reemergence of life in this season. I look forward to hearing how folks are doing that, what practices, maybe even what rituals people have for that kind of renewing, resurrecting, enlivening.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Thank you so much for being
absolutely
on the podcast. This was such a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your hospitality and making someone who is an avid podcast listener and terrified of actually being on podcasts and still trying to figure out how I'm even part of the hosting of Enfleshed podcast because of the incredible encouragement and magic of Robert and Em that I'm doing that. But thank you for this invitation and for making it so hospitable and so fun.
Yeah. Our first reading for this episode is from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. The life of the early church is described as members abandon greed and class disparity for equity and the abolishment of poverty.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of sharing resources, right? The early churches said that they hold everything together. And I was thinking about Encanto, because I think that is the goal and the hope for Encanto. It gets a little off track, and that's what the plot is around, is how it has gotten off track and how to get it more in track. But ultimately it is the sharing of resources, which includes those who are gifted sharing their gift in more and particular ways. But the community that Abuela founded is just such a shared, we do better when we are together, and those of us who have more are expected to do more, to give more. And eventually it becomes a within reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in verse 42, we read, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers." And this, I was probably one of, if not the oldest rituals in Christianity. Fair game, the breaking of bread. Probably they were using lembas bread, because lembas, and it helps with the nourishing and sustaining of people throughout the day. But probably for first breakfast and not second breakfast.
No, at all. And in verse 45, we read, "They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need." And I've listened to a few different live play D&D campaigns, and there are, generally speaking, about two approaches to how you handle the money, right? Either the party pools their money into one general group fund, or each character tracks their own purse. And a lot of new players insist on personal purses because that's what they're used to in, real life, which makes sense. And also they might not, know or trust the people they're playing with, or for that matter, the characters that their friends are playing, depending on how into the role play you get, that much. And that also makes sense. But really, having listened to a few different campaigns now, it seems like having a larger pool of money to work with as a group allows the party to focus on their group goals and also encourages a lot of team building, as well as involving way less micromanaging for everybody. And so how you choose to handle the money in D&D really does change your gameplay in a big way.
Yeah, as long as you don't make Judas the one who is actually holding the purse.
Yeah, no, don't pick an embezzler for the treasurer. That's not going to be helpful.
Also, don't forget, we have a whole episode in defense of Judas, so feel free to check that out. We like Judas. We're not terrible people. Okay. Our second reading is from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 19 through 25. The author discusses unjust suffering and Jesus' response to it. One of the themes in this passage is the idea of integrity, right? Integrity in, are you suffering because you did something wrong or because you did something right, kind of stuff. And it reminded me of, towards the end of the West Wing series, there's a point at which there are astronauts stuck in the space station, and Toby's brother, I think, is one of them or something. But Toby leaks that there is an extra space shuttle that could be used to save them. But it's a secret one. And he doesn't come right out and admit that he did that, but he does eventually, when it is discovered that he was the one who leaked the secret, he does eventually own what he did and the consequences of that, which are going to jail, even though he has like teeny tiny twin kids, but that like it was that important to him. And
I believe the stakes were whether or not his brother died. So
yeah, like the astronauts were going to die if they didn't rescue them. And that has always been one of those points. Like, Toby is not always my favorite character. He's kind of the Oscar the Grouch grumpy character, except I love Oscar the Grouch. He's not always my favorite character, but in that moment I was like, like
absolutely
super solid. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 20 we read, if you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, where is the credit in that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. And I was just struck by like the ways for me that connected to the civil rights movement and the sit-ins and like the training that they had to go through in order to be able to endure when they were doing right, so that they didn't react and respond to the suffering that they would face from racists.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, it's impressive, like if you read or learn about like the full everything that they were doing.
Absolutely. And then in verse 23, we read, when Jesus was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And while we're at it, Jesus also did not insist that because he had suffered, other people had to go through that same suffering too. Like, Jesus is not disappointed that crucifixions have thankfully gone out of style.
Yep.
Let's be clear. Jesus is in favor of that. And imagine if we all actually took the idea of, well, I suffered, so other people have to suffer too. I mean, at that rate, we would all be dead from car crashes and nuclear meltdowns and all sorts of other things. So, I've never really understood that point of view. It doesn't seem to actually go anywhere useful.
Yeah. I particularly love when that point of view is, and I'm fine. You're not fine if you are wishing suffering on other people just because you suffered. That's like, we wish better for everyone, including you. Yeah.
Yes. And part of wishing better for you is wishing that you would stop wishing harm on other people.
Yep.
Yeah. And our gospel reading for today is from John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Jesus describes himself and his relationship with us with a sheepfold-related metaphor.
So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of abundant life, right? That is part of what Jesus is talking about and promising, and that is like the goal of Moana, right? The island is no longer a space of abundant life, and so she is seeking abundant life, not just for her, and she's not just seeking an adventure, but she is seeking abundant life for her people. And I love that kind of imagery that comes at the end of Moana, where there is abundant life, but there is this like really important part that happens before that, where there's like repair and restoration before it gets to abundant life, but that there is a possibility. There is always a possibility of abundant life.
Absolutely. So as we jump into the verses, in verse 1 we read, Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit." And okay, Jesus, fine. That's fine. But also, we're reading this like 2 weeks after we saw you beam into the upper room with the disciples, like Miles O'Brien himself was at the transporter controls. So what does that make you, exactly? Or are the rules for a sheepfold different than the room that the disciples were in someone's
locked,
home?
fearful rooms. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, like, I don't know if that makes Jesus a red shirt. I mean, he did die, after all. So if this was Star Trek, that would kind of be on track.
That was too good.
I don't understand how this works. You're allowed to, magically appear wherever you want, but anyone who climbs over a fence, or presumably in through a window, like I suggested a couple weeks ago, is a thief and a bandit. You're going to have to give us a little more context, I'm just saying.
That is so good.
Yeah.
I'm still stuck on Jesus being a red shirt. I want to hear Trekkie's opinions about that, because I feel like there are lots of strong opinions about that.
That means that Jesus would be the, junior ensign of the crew, and would...
It's true. Your logic is solid. I just want to hear everybody else's A, gut reactions, and then B, more thought out responses. Sure. Please, Trekkies, tell us what you think.
And remember, when we say red shirt,
send us an email.
That term came from the original series, when the red shirts were worn by the engineering and security personnel, as opposed to later on in the later series, they had switched that so that the gold was worn by engineering and security and the red was worn by command. Because, the rules about what dynamic colors were the most exciting changed or something. So.
Yeah. But seriously, nerdsetchurch@gmail.com or on our socials. Tell us what you think. Anyway, I looked at verse 4, which reads, Jesus says, "When the shepherd has brought out all their own, the shepherd goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow the shepherd because they know the voice." So this, I kind of alluded to this in the talked about this in Let's Make a Muppets musical, but there's this story of shepherds standing in corners of the sheepfold, of like real life shepherds standing in different corners of the sheepfold and singing, because the shepherds, I guess, had like a habit of singing to their sheep. And the sheep from all of the different flocks are like in the sheepfold together and mixed up. And then as the shepherds in each corner start to sing, the sheep divide themselves up and go to their respective shepherds, because they know their voice. So when Jesus is saying this, it's not like some weirdo abstract thing, but it's like a real thing. And so I was thinking about that, and now I've got like Electric Mayhem set up in the corners, playing like different people from Electric Mayhem playing the different parts and singing. And
absolutely.
Yeah, love it. Also, if you want more about shepherds, because this is Good Shepherd Sunday, you should definitely check out last year's Good Shepherd episode, because we had an actual shepherd on.
Yes, it was great.
So it was great to have Polyfesta on for that episode, and you should check it out, and we will link to it. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 5th Sunday of Easter. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsetchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than forming your own ministry and starting your own podcast and creating your own ritual resource and doing all sorts of other things like that.
Yeah.
Like in Trust Chas.
Give us money and we'll connect you to the people who are doing it anyway.
Yes.
/ already. Yep.
Sure.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode, whether it's who you're doing a ritual with or who you're casting in the stories.
Yes. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.